Hello YouTube. Kazakhstan. On the vast territory of this country, you can find a variety of natural zones and landscapes. The largest area here is occupied by deserts and steppes. The word steppe refers to the grassland of Eastern Europe and Asia. The eastern part of Kazakhstan is occupied by the foothills of the Altai. The heights here are small and the mountain slopes are covered with forest, mainly of the taiga or boreal forest type. The southern border is formed by the mountain ranges of the eastern Tian Shan, extending into the territory of Mongolia and China. The famous Silk Road was located here, and the trade exchange between China and Europe was carried out. Dozens of highly developed civilizations arose and died on this vast territory. Hordes of nomads repeatedly raced through here. Fierce battles of numerous wars painted the land in the red color of spilled blood. Various people came and went, but the steppes and mountains remained in their places, including humanoids. Enough of geography and history. We are interested first of all in the wild man, who is called differently on the territory of Kazakhstan. In the mountainous regions, it's Ksy-Gyik, which means goat man. In eastern Kazakhstan, he is often called the same as in Mongolia, almas. In the southern regions, the Uzbek name Yavoy Adam that's its wild man, that's what it means. And in the steppe regions, he or she sometimes is called Khurjin, or master. Well, the first official report that a wild hairy humanoid creature lives in eastern Kazakhstan belongs to the student of St. Petersburg University, Vladimir Khokhlov, who in 1912 submitted a memo to the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences, where it remained unattended for more than 50 years in a folder that was titled "For Documents of No Scientific Significance." Yes, a truly invaluable contribution to the study of the question of the wild man was made by this very young scientist, Khokhlov, who, by the way, was born in 1895. He came from a highly intelligent family who lived in eastern Kazakhstan, in the city of Zaysan. All the leaders of expeditions going to the mountains and deserts of Central Asia, and I talked about some of them. Look up my videos about Mongolia or the Russian spy and explorer Przhevalsky. Anyway, all of them necessarily stayed in the house of this family of Khokhlovs. And the young Khokhlov met with Przhevalsky and other Russian imperial explorers and scientists. Listening to their conversations, he learned a lot of interesting things about the nature of Central Asia. No wonder he decided to become a biologist. When the time came for field practice, he asked to be sent to his native territories. Traveling around the area and collecting various collections, he met with hunters, stayed with shepherds, listened to their conversations around the campfires in the evening, and asked about the animals living in these places. That's how he first heard about the wild hairy man, who is sometimes encountered in the surrounding forests by the Kyrgyz and Kazakhs. They call this creature Ksy-Gyik, and the Mongols call it almas, like I said. After a while, he became acquainted with eyewitnesses. In particular, he was told that the two Kazakhs who lived in the Saykan mountains near the Kenderlik River, they were doing horse herding. At dawn, they saw a human figure shape creeping towards the horses. Deciding that it was a horse thief, they, armed with harnesses, crept up to him. After catching this man, they tied him up. The prisoner turned out to be a short, stocky man. His arms were as long as monkeys. He stooped with a short neck. Brow ridges stood out above the eyes. The lower jaw was chinless, the fangs were large, the ears pointed, without lobes, the nose was small with deep nostrils. There was a ridge, like protrusion on the back of his head. He kept his legs constantly half bent. His feet resembled human ones, but were wider, with widely spaced toes. The tail was missing. Another reliable evidence was reported by a Kazakh living near the lake Ulyungur. He saw a wild female cryptid who was caught and chained in a village on the Manas River. Cryptid here refers to large and hairy human-like entity. It looked exactly as described by the first witness, so it wasn't too large. This creature ate raw meat, vegetables, grains, and insects. In the end, people took pity on the savage and let her go. Freed from the chains, she immediately disappeared into the thicket. The young scientist not only listened attentively to these stories, but he also wrote them down. Having systematized and generalized what he heard, he was able not only to make a detailed description of the appearance of this creature, its lifestyle and behavior, but also compile a verbal portrait of it, which was corrected and approved by eyewitnesses who saw this creature with their own eyes. The year was 1913. Arriving in St. Petersburg, he presented to the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences a detailed report on the wild men of Central Asia, but, as I mentioned before, there was no reaction to this report from the unknown student. But 50 years later, Professor Porshnev, who was very much known worldwide for his research of the abominable snowman, humanoids, hominids, and so forth, well, he found the report in the folder for documents that have no scientific significance. But Khokhlov did not give up. He introduced the materials obtained to the famous scientist Professor Sushkin, who at that time was developing a hypothesis of the origin of man not in the tropical forests of Africa, but in the mountainous regions of Central Asia. Sushkin was very interested in the information received by Khokhlov in East Kazakhstan, so he began to prepare a special expedition there for the following year. But then the First World War broke out, and all the large-scale plans of Professor Sushkin and student Khokhlov were never destined to come true. Only a few years later, the writer Zverev from Alma-Ata became aware that Khokhlov's acquaintances, the Kazakhs, not the Kazakhs, but the Kazakhs, of one of the outposts located near Lake Zaysan, prepared a gift. They prepared a gift for the young scientist in 1914. In the spring, they caught a cryptid girl in the reeds and kept her at their outpost. But then the news came about the beginning of the war. The Kazakhs took their prisoner back to the reeds, and they released her. Now let's get acquainted with some more recent reports from the different regions of Kazakhstan. And when I say recent, we'll go back to the beginning of the 20th century. Polina Vakulina's story. It happened around 1935 at Buskul station in the Kostanay region. And the guys and I were playing lapta. That's a Russian game like baseball. There were four of us. We lived on the last street, then stretched to the steppe, that street, and the road to the village of Tarutino. About 3 or 4 o'clock, a truck drove up and stopped not far from us. The driver jumped out of it, opened the side. 4 men jumped off and began to pull off someone who looked like a bear. We ran closer to the car, and saw that it was not a bear, but a shaggy man standing on his feet. He was much taller than those men. His hands were tied, and he was led by a rope towards the railway crossing. There was a train station on the other side, as well as a village council and the Soviet police station. What happened to him next, I do not know. Excuse me. Then rumors spread that this shaggy man was caught by foresters in the Taratuntin forest. In the year 1950, 4 naked, hairy, humanoid creatures appeared at once at the apiary of a person named Minin, located a few kilometers from the village of Maraliha. The beekeeper and his family took refuge in a barn and holed up there until the uninvited guests left. Well, the guests behaved quite decently. They didn't break anything, just wandered around and examined everything with curiosity. In 1956, the hunter by the name of Obitai from the village of Bayankol went hunting up in the gorge of the river. There was still snow on the slopes. Suddenly, to the left of the road, he saw tracks of bare human feet that were winding through the trees. The tracks were small. At this time of year, locals do not walk barefoot in the snow, especially far from the village. Then the tracks led to the road and got lost among other tracks. Suddenly I hear a whistle, said Obitai, then another, and then some screams ahead of me. I picked up speed and soon around the bend, very close to the road, I saw a boy about 12 years old. He was not wearing any clothes. His whole body was covered with hair. He was standing near the fir tree and shaking it with both hands. He was obviously very ill. He was screaming and crying. He was about 20 meters from the road, but it was still light, and you could see that the skin under his hair was completely dark or dirty, and the face was dark. On the head, the hair was long, tangled. The hair was all over the body, on the arms and legs too. Dark, rather short, not very thick. When I drove up, he continued to stand up and shout, looking at me. He shouted in a thin and shrill voice. The hunter did not know what to do and whether it was necessary to help him. Maybe he was afraid of a man on a horse, this boy, the scripted boy, and called out to his parents. In the 1960s, when the hype about the abominable snowman started in the Soviet media, and I remember it well, even though I was a boy, I was trying to read as much as I could. Anyway, an elderly Kazakh came to the director of the Museum of Local Lore in the city of Kurchum, East Kazakhstan region, Zaysan district. That's where I believe Hakhlov is from. Anyway, his name was Kushnikov, this head of the director of the Museum of Local Lore. The old man pointed to a drawing of Neanderthal that obviously was in the museum, and he said, "We also have such. We call them Ksy-Gyik, or wild people. They don't live here all the time, but sometimes they appear. They don't attack people. They always run away. There used to be a lot of them. In the autumn, they went to China. They walked along the Bukhtarminsk Ridge." And in the 1970s, a young tractor driver from the village of Pugacheva looked at the images of Neanderthals and Pithecanthropus for a long time in the same museum. And then he said, in 1977, I was working in the forest and I saw this. I worked in the upper reaches of the Kurchum River near Karashir. I got thirsty and went to the river, squatted down and began to drink. Suddenly I feel that someone is looking at me. I looked around, I saw that a hairy woman was peeking out from behind the nearest rock, leaning out to half of her torso. Another tractor driver told Kushnikov that he worked on road repairs. Stopping at a stream, he bent down to drink, and out of the corner of his eye he saw a hairy woman looking at him from behind a large boulder. Such a person looks out like in this picture. And he pointed to the image of Neanderthal. She was female. She had the same saggy breasts as is painted here, but she was not so naked. Thick brown hair grew on her chest and arms, and the hair on the head was long and shaggy. My father, when I told him about it, replied, however, you have seen the Ksy-Gyik. Don't tell anyone about this, or they will laugh at you. In the 1990s, almost simultaneously, in many newspapers of northern and western Kazakhstan, there were reports about the appearance of entire families of wild, hairy people. Residents of the Sergeyevsky, Ili districts, in the Kazakh Urals and in the vicinity of Alma-Ata talked about encounters with them. In the newspaper Kazakhstanskaya Pravda, the correspondent of the Kazakh television Plishakov said the following. In the Sergeyevsky district, policeman by the name of Mukanov and his wife were riding a motorcycle. Driving past a plowed field, they noticed a tall, shaggy man moving through the plowing area at about the same speed as the motorcyclists. The policeman signaled to him, after which the furry man accelerated, and having overtaken the motorcyclist by 400 meters, crossed the road and disappeared in the forest. After a few hundred meters, the road was flooded with water and there was nowhere to go around it. We turned around and went home. After a couple of minutes, something made me turn around, said the policeman's wife, Altinai. I saw that soon several more shaggy giants jumped out of the forest and ran in our direction. I had to turn around and run away urgently. In the year 1990, policeman Ibragimov and his wife, and also his friend Buldin, were riding a motorcycle when they saw two huge, hairy people standing on the road ahead. The policeman stopped in fear, turned the motorcycle around, and raced in the opposite direction. But when he looked back, he saw that the hairy giants were chasing him. Dosan Sadikov, the secretary of the Communist Party Committee of the Ibraev District Technical Farm, asked the policeman and his wife what happened next. Ibragimov said that the giants were almost catching up with the madly racing motorcycle when suddenly Buldin, who was sitting in the sidecar, had his cap torn off his head. Seeing an unfamiliar object that had fallen to the ground, the pursuers stopped and began to study it. Taking advantage of this delay, the policeman and his passengers were able to break away from the chase. Some people heard a strong scream or roar, which was obviously made by these creatures. The locals, of course, knew from the old people about the existence of hairy giants, but for the most part, they did not encounter them and even consider all the stories about them to be fiction. How to explain the mass appearance of the hairy people in several districts of northern Kazakhstan, where no one has seen them for decades? Perhaps this was caused by the fact that the former habitats of these creatures in the adjacent areas, due to the economic activities of people, became unsuitable for them. The development of gas and oil production in the Kuybyshev region, Bashkiria and Tatarstan, that's in Russia, the shallowing of rivers and lakes in Kazakhstan, and the resulting disappearance of thousands of kilometers of Tugay along the banks of rivers and lakes. These nature reserves for all living things in the zone of steppes and deserts. Well, Tugay is a form of riparian forest or woodland associated with fluvial and floodplain areas in arid climates. These wetlands are subject to periodic inundation and largely dependent on floods and groundwater rather than directly from rainfall. Tugay habitats occur in semi-arid and desert climates in Central Asia. I'm telling you this because if you ever travel to Kazakhstan, and it's a great area to visit, please see my videos. First of all, about ancient cultures and vanished cities and UFO sightings that go back for thousands of years and ancient aliens. See my video. You will like Kazakhstan. It's a wonderful, very rich country in resources, people, and history. But you will also know where to look if you choose to for the Ksy-Gyik and other cryptids. because some people ask me, so to say, for directions, and I can only tell you what my research finds. I wish I visited all of the places I tell you about. I have some, but not all. Anyway, so going back to why the abominable snowman or Ksy-Gyik, why they came to northern Kazakhstan. Maybe having reached the extreme, the hairy aborigines, the true indigenous owners of these places, went in search of new areas suitable for their habitat. Hairy giants were seen in these places for a short time, after which they disappeared. Most likely, they went to the mountain forest of Altai and Tian Shan. This is quite possible. And of course, I need to talk more about the Altai hominids as well, and the time will come. But in 2016, something interesting happened. Sensational and at the same time frightening news from East Kazakhstan region. The abominable snowman showed up there. He was noticed by several locals at once. Farmers say that the Yeti steals their cattle. The fact that the snowman lives in the Altai mountains has been talked about for a long time, but before it was just a rumor. We know it's not so, but the newspaper people, they're not the brightest sometimes. Anyway, now there were witnesses. Local resident Ksy-Gyik said that he encountered a Yeti in the evening when he was checking the cattle in his compound. He heard a strange sound, and when he looked closer, he almost turned gray with fear. The farmer saw a huge man covered with thick fur hair, and he grabbed one of his sheep from the other side of the pen, climbed over the fence, and quickly walked away towards the mountains. The man noted that the height of the uninvited guest exceeded 2 meters. His arms were unusually long, and his gait somewhat resembled that of a monkey. The cattleman was so scared that he was afraid to return to the house and spent the night at the local police station. In the morning, when Ksy-Gyik returned to his place, to his home, he found traces of blood on the fence of the cattle pen with the paw print of the night visitor. After the rest of the locals found out about it, it was decided to organize a special group. A posse? Well, the group embarked to the mountains in search of the Bigfoot. People are not so much afraid of the stolen sheep. They're afraid first of all for the safety of the children. Children play outside in Kazakhstan. Anyway, after all, the Bigfoot in Kazakhstan has been encountered before. A few years ago, mountain climbers saw a mysterious creature in the mountainous area of the Almaty region. It should be noted an interesting detail. Out of the whole mass of reports about the appearance of hairy giants on the territory of Kazakhstan, none of them mentions an attack on livestock and poultry or theft of food, except for the 2016 case. That's through my research. This behavior is characteristic of some animals that have their own hunting or feeding areas that they mark. An alien individual of the same species, once on such a site, always behaves very modestly. An example, I was told, is the behavior of the huge Great Dane, who, having entered the territory marked by a small poodle, crosses it with his tail between its legs. These are the unwritten laws of behavior of many animals in the wild. This, of course, does not concern the relationship of predators to their victims, who have their own laws. Let me give you now a few examples of other Yeti or Ksy-Gyik or alma, or call it whatever you want, in different parts of the Soviet Union, just as a comparison. You can find out more in my other videos about the humanoid cryptids. There are a number of them in my channel, back from the Russian imperial times, the Soviet times, and modern era too. But let's look at Siberia. a lot of people are quite serious. They say there's no mysticism about the appearance of these strange creatures. People saw this with their own eyes in the taiga, and many of their village people did also see it. And until the 1930s, the humanoid cryptids, were not exactly teeming in the taiga, but there were a lot of them there. It was then that the construction began. The sawmills went up, and other facilities, and the wild people, so to say, went supposedly to the north, to the uninhabited places. And exactly, it's no mysticism, according to some. It's not a goblin or a devil, it's just an animal, though very smart. Well, a bear and a wolverine are not fools either. Yes, animals. A big creature, woolly with simian face, completely overgrown with wild hair. And yes, they do not know how to speak. It is reliably known. And in Siberia, some researchers, whose views I'm presenting here, they've never heard that they lured women or offended somehow. There were no cases. They weren't the first to offend anyone at all if you didn't touch them. Well, there were no fools to touch the wild man first, to get them aggravated. The attitude toward them was the most calm in Siberia at the time. They, unlike other animals, never brought harm to anyone. Well, if you look at my other videos, there were different reports from the Caucasus, for example. But again, I don't want to say it's anecdotal, but I wish there was serious research. And in Russia, people like Poroshenko, and Khokhlov before him, and a few others, and like the French woman Kaufman, who lived in Russia, they were very serious about this research. But that's not enough, Unfortunately, our scientists are very ossified in their thinking when it comes to research of the hominids. Anyway, here's a very interesting area for those who follow my research of the Russian paranormal, this report. It's the story of the chief engineer of a large association company from Nizhny Tunguska. And the date is 1977. So just like in Kazakhstan, which is not that, if you think about it, that really far away from there. So this is Siberia, and Kazakhstan is to the north. Anyway, this man did not even conduct oil exploration in the Avenkia area himself. He only organized the search. The work was coming to the end, and it was the end of August. It was already autumn in these places. And the engineer kicked himself in the chest. For the entire summer, he was basically sitting, looking at maps, listening to the bosses, obtain fuel, check the work of detachments and the drilling rigs. But he never went on the route, on the itinerary himself. He did not cast a fishing rod, did not pick up a gun to hunt, and he would soon turn 50 years old. And how many summers were in front of him? How many years he had to live? This is what he was thinking. So this engineer, he took everything that he needed and went up to the river, to the drilling rig. 3 days of walking along the path through uninhabited places, without any radio and without communication at all, in complete violation of all safety regulations. He walked and walked, enjoying the noise of the taiga and the river, peace and the opportunity to be alone with nature for once. On the third day of this journey, in the evening, not far from the drilling rig, the engineer suddenly noticed a large man standing in the water up to his knees. The water flowed here quickly, forming whirlpools around the legs, but it spread wide, shallow, and the man was doing something in the water, moving his hands there. Either he was washing something or he was collecting something at the bottom. This was the first person the engineer saw in 3 days of travel. "Hey!" the engineer shouted and waved his hand to the standing man. The man straightened up, waved back, and again waved his hand in the river. "Hey," the engineer yelled again. "How are things at the drilling site?" He was already close, about 50 meters away, when the one standing in the river straightened up again. Water was dripping from his hands, and in his right hand he was holding a hefty, struggling fish, burbot. And the engineer was seized with horror. In front of him was not a man from the drilling rig at all, but a shaggy brown-haired giant, at least 2 meters tall. The eyes burned red in the twilight, and the face turned to the engineer. It was gloomy. The giant waved the fish in the engineer's direction, growled something in a cracking voice. The engineer stood rooted to the spot, frantically thinking whether to pull off the carbine, his weapon. The giant stood still and then walked slowly into the forest. The engineer, trying to stay away from the windfall, dense thickets and depressions, keeping his hand on the lock of the carbine, approached the drilling rig by nightfall. It did not escape him how surprised, even frightened people were by his appearance. There was something in their behavior that went far beyond the apprehension of subordinates, to whom the high authority suddenly appeared before them. "What are you afraid of? Did he attack anyone? Who is he?" "Well, who?" "The one who lives down the river. We just met with him." "Well, tell me, who was he chasing?" "Yes, I didn't. Well, he comes and looks." "And you should have fired a gun?" "Well, can you imagine if you fired a gun? We heard him. Could you imagine what he would do?" "No, we're just like that. We just waited out. He's not attacking." Did you give him food?" "Well, look, fish was given. We'll catch fish. He will come and look. And you immediately run." "Yes, don't run." "What are you? We left it on purpose. And he will catch a burbot, bringing it and wave in our direction. He seems to ask if we want it." The researcher who wrote down this report, then he asked the engineer why they didn't take a picture of the man of the woods, did not examine the tracks, the wall. And the response was this: that was because a helicopter arrived the next morning. It rumbled for a long time, it flew back and forth over this place and left. And then they, the engineer and the workers, they waited. They even went to look for the creature, but they didn't find him. Probably the abominable snowman, the cryptid, hominid, call it whatever you want. Probably he departed to a quieter place. And, as we expand our presence throughout the planet, even in those places that we basically never ventured to before, the other creatures who live there, whether exotic animals or maybe those whose intelligence is not on par with ours, or maybe higher intelligence, they move to other places. Some of them go under the soil, underground. Some of them disappear in the thickets. And believe me, in Russia, there are areas, and Kazakhstan too, but in the Russian taiga and so forth, where no foot of mother man has ever stepped. And my father, when he served in the Soviet army in Siberia and the Far East, he was in the communications units. And he told me a lot of stories about unusual life in those territories. And I share some of them with you. But trust me, there are enough places for the hominids and cryptids to exist on this planet. Some of them are harmless in a way, as the abominable snowman seems to be. Some are not so harmless. But I have to tell you more about such creatures that exist in the Urals, up in the forest of the Ural Mountains area. Very interesting I think in the areas also of the polar Urals, and more about Siberia, because there were other sightings. Thank you for your attention to my work. If you can support me, you'll find the links in the description to this video. And of course, look at my playlists. You will find all kinds of information there about Kazakhstan, about Central Asia, about the cryptids of Eurasia, and so forth. Please like my channel, please subscribe to it. Thank you so much.